Let's go ahead and get started. I've got 4 o'clock. So, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Matt Smith, and I'm Chief Evangelist for Envato, and I'm glad you joined us for this discussion on 4K today. With us today are Will Law, Chief Media Architect for Digital Media with Akamai, Joe Einstein, who's VP of Operations for AMG, and Ian Tro, who is Senior Director of Emerging Technology and Strategy for Harmonic. Gentlemen, thank you. So a bit of a preamble to kind of set the table. I think this is going to be a lively discussion, and hopefully we provide you with some of the information and data points that you're here to assess. But to kind of set the table, to my mind, 4K seems to be one of the latest emerging buzzwords and rumored trends in our industry. I'm sure some of you have heard, and maybe for the right, maybe for the wrong reasons, which we'll explore here. In today's discussion, we want to take a look at this and understand the fundamentals, the business needs, requirements, the future path, and the hopes that we can bring a better understanding to bear for all of us. Some fear that 4K will be the next 3D TV, where the tail is wagging the dog. It seems that some broadcasters and potential customers may begin to feel that they've been duped into selecting workflow solutions that support 4K when no need exists, or at least not yet. So you consider this. A few data points to think about. There's a lot of talk about 4K from a technical level, but we haven't heard a whole lot of the business problems surface that have been associated with 4K. For example, I know Will's got a ton of good data on this, and I'm looking forward to hearing that too. The average Netflix stream across the top 10 ISPs is delivered at roughly 2.5 megabits per second. Amazon, Netflix, and Comcast have all announced 4K streaming products that deliver content to you over the top at 15 to 20 megabits per second. That's about 8 times what Netflix is delivering today. The latest data from Conviva, which classifies HD as between 1 to 2 megabits per second, shows that as a whole that CDNs have a lot of problems delivering content at 2 megabits per second with reliable quality. And with a caveat there, I think we're talking, across an entire geography, not in, particular little pockets. And last but not least, a data point that I found as recently as last week, where a lot of the post-production facilities that are editing the medium and longer form content that a lot of us consume, like episodic television, are for shows like NCIS Los Angeles, Perception, Cougar Town, have said that none of their clients have requested 4K masters of those shows. Concerning when we're talking about streaming it, that people who are editing the content aren't preserving that in 4K permanently. So with that, I want to turn to the panelists and at least get their preamble, get their thoughts on 4K, and then dive in, explore some specific topics, and we'll open it up to you for questions. So with that, Will, what's the state of 4K today? What says our media architect?
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having us. So yes, I will say from the outset, I'm a pragmatic optimist about 4K, and I'm also a student of history. And I wanted almost to print out a session we had at Streaming Media East about 6 years ago that was talking about the new format coming out, how it was larger, there were no screens to display it, there were no devices to play it, content wasn't produced in it. And that format was 1080p. And 6 years ago, we were having exactly the same discussion. And I think in the essence of that site, we're going to repeat it again. In 6 years' time, we're going to be looking back, and we will see a transition from 720 to 1080 to 4K. So, Matt, you put a lot of provocative stats out there. I just want to address the first one. Why is...
Sorry, I have to switch. This one's buzzing for some reason. Thank you so much.
Am I buzzing less? Ooh, feels weird now. Yes, I am. So maybe you missed the first part of my intro dialogue, but why is 4K different to 3D? So if you went to CES 4 years ago, you saw 3D everywhere. Everyone put glasses on. There were screens you didn't need glasses for. There were ones that gave you a headache after 5 minutes, one after 20 minutes. 3D was everywhere. You go to CES this year, 3D is nowhere. It's the mark of the devil. You don't want to see 3D. It just means you're missing the boat. So are they fundamentally different? Yes. 4K doesn't involve new viewing technology. You, as a lazy human, don't have to do anything other than sit back in your same comfy chair and watch a super cool, large format screen that has your favorite sports game on it. much less, there's no change required on the consumer. The viewing experience uniformly, assuming the content is right, and this will be a center of the discussion today, is better. It's great. It's like having little IMAX in your house. IMAX is a 4K standard, or it's basically dual 2K. It's like having IMAX in your own home at that sort of size. There isn't a man amongst us or a woman who doesn't want to watch sports in that format today, assuming we deliver the quality. So I think fundamentally 4K has a much surer and predictable plot than 3D ever did. And I think we'll be seeing a lot more of it. The question will come, how do we generate the content? Do we have enough bandwidth to deliver it to the consumer? What are the various ways we can get it to those consumers, and when should we start doing that? And I'll talk for all of that, but I'll hand over to Joe.
Yeah, Joe, you work with customers who are in the business of capturing this content, creating events, where there's a live event, and you're helping them facilitate the delivery of that to a variety of screens. What are you hearing from your customers with regard to their plans for 4K?
I think from the sort of service provider model, we're seeing a lot of interest in, is it possible? Could we do it? A lot of it seems like it's coming from we want to be the first ones to do 4K marketing dollars. Seems like they're going to pay for it. At least on the sort of the streaming sides, the big conferences, the music events. What we are seeing is a lot of the events we are streaming today are being acquired in 4K, archived in 4K. The price difference on the production side is not like it was with 3D, where it's basically a different production. It's the same production, and we take a 1080 master out. What we are seeing, though, is that even when you look at the satellite transmission or fiber transmission to a traditional broadcaster or a theater distribution network, which we do a lot of, it's still really hard and it's really expensive. And that's not even talking about getting it back to one of our broadcast centers and then compressing it for the web and trying to deliver an 8, 10, or 12 megabit streaming file. So I think if we take a step back and look at just getting it from point A to point B, it's many times more expensive than your traditional HD transmission. So I think that problem's got to get solved. And then we look at the CDN, the distribution, the encoding side.
Ian, for the uninitiated in the audience, can you kind of walk us through the technical fundamentals of 4K? So it's 4 times the resolution. What does that mean for a video distribution organization like yours, where you're having to compress the bits and get them to where they need to go? Talk about the complexity of the resolution and then the hard work that hardware has to do. I mean, how hard is it?
Well, a couple of benchmarks. People always ask about the complexity in terms of processing and memory between H.264 and HEVC. And there's something like a 12 times uplift between the complexity for MPEG-4 or H.264 versus HEVC. On the decoder side, the same analogy, there's about a 3 or 4 times multiplier there. And why are people trying to do that? Add complexity. It's purely to get more bit rate efficiency. So if you're actually looking at the scenario at the moment, say for good quality HEVC native transmission, people are saying that between about 15 to 20 megabits is where you're looking at. That's a considerable uplift on the kind of bit rates that people are using for premium satellite services. And I think one of the issues that has made it challenging marketing 4K and UHD, at least for the pragmatists, is the fact that you've got to have an access rate of 15 megabits per second to really make a difference. And I'll qualify that because there are a lot of people out there who are actually trying to acquire UHD or 4K content, either because it fits in with the cinematic area or they're trying to future-proof their content. But the real key issue at the moment is whether you actually have that 4K asset, you down-convert it to 1080p, and then you transmit it and subsequently up-convert it. And at NAB, I didn't have anyone question the premise that up to rates of about 15 megabits per second, that was the best way of doing it. So, there's no surprise that some of the presentations this morning have talked about 16 megabit being what Netflix are purporting to say that they need for native 4K. And that's awkward because, as you were alluding to with the access rates, sort of a fraction of those kind of rates now. It's no surprise that for most of the inquiries that we're seeing now are to take cinematic assets, transcode them offline. And so you're seeing this initial streaming market, which there's a good tie-up between 4K cinematic content and the delivery mechanisms, and it's no surprise that we're talking about it in a streaming context. But what is far, far more difficult is to make the justification, and particularly the commercial background, to actually talk about sports events. You're already seeing people like Sky Deutschland doing Bundesliga transmissions. But for what is a comparatively simple scenario of actually producing an asset, encoding it, and then streaming it, and I confess that I'm just talking about the infrastructure here, there are many, many problems with making that scenario work for true native 4K or UHD content in a TV environment.
I agree with you. Case in point, I was at the cable show in Los Angeles just 2 weeks ago, and was at the Comcast booth looking at a 4K demo that, when it didn't choke, looked great. But it was a video loop that seemed to choke in the same point. So you could tell that there was a problem, even in that small little, media chain where something wasn't working with another thing properly. So I want to kind of get into the real semantics of delivering this content. To prep this panel, I sent him a note and said, just a few years ago, we were looking at HD in terms of WMVHD.com. For those of you who have been in this industry enough, this was Microsoft's first pass at doing HD streaming content. It was primarily progressive download at that time, to be honest. And it doesn't seem like it was that long ago. So now we're here today, and we're doing actually lots of 720p content, and even some good 1080p content, right? So, especially in the case of Netflix, and I want Will to touch on this, where they're doing 4K with at least some of their original titles. But the complexity of really getting this content from point A to point B over, and I know you're going to take exception with this, but an unmanaged network, where you're not talking about a Verizon Fios managed network or Time Warner or et cetera, but where it's on the public internet. And granted, Akamai has one of my favorite CDNs on the whole planet, but the complexities of delivering a file to somebody at 20 megabits per second in a stately fashion to where they don't lose that connection is a pretty large proposition, right? I mean, how do we achieve that?
So let's talk about bandwidth and delivery, because there's a lot of statistics being put out, and there's the famous statement of lies, and statistics. We've got to be very careful when we quote averages. No one here is proclaiming that 4K is the average throughput we can achieve. So Akamai is a large CDN. You may know us as that. We serve about 30-something million requests per second and deliver about 20 terabits per second of content. That's 20,000 gigabits per second. The majority of that is video. On every one of those deliveries, we measure the throughput speed. So we have a good idea, we feel, and we publish all these stats every quarter. It's called the State of the Internet Report, and we make them public. So you can go to our website, and there's cool interactive charts that show this data, and we break it down by state in the United States, by country worldwide. We show these stats. So you get a very clear, and we show it for the last 7 years. So you get a great historical perspective of average throughput. So it just came out now for the last quarter. We're always one quarter behind. The average throughput in the United States today, measured to our servers, just crossed 10 megabits per second. And that's an average from super well-connected people in the Bay Area down to Savannah, Georgia, where I used to live, and it's not great connectivity. Okay, that's an average across the entire country. But there's a distribution curve in that. There are obviously people who can't get more than 400 kilobits per second. There's people regularly getting 50 to 80 megabits per second. So then we also decided to do a study on who can get 4K today. For that, we looked at the average throughput. Now, the average throughput is 10 megs. We also plot the peak throughput that we measure, which is this one-off. We're not saying you can sustain this all the time, but your connection at one point in time was capable. This, for the United States, is more than 30 megabits per second today. And again, these are averages. So we got very well Google Fiber-connected people pulling up the rest of the country. But the average being 10, we did a study of who's got more than 15 megabits per second average. So we took all the IPs, we threw away the upper 20% to try to make it more realistic. So we took the 80th percentile. And then we plotted these. We looked at the percentage of connections that are greater than 15 megabits per second. And then we plotted a heat map of the United States. And you can see just about every state, at least 20% of the population can sustain 15. That number goes to 40 and 60% as you get into the dense urban areas, like the Northeast, especially the Northwest, California, the Bay Area, and Florida, particularly enough. And I don't want to pull up the stats. You can go see this in our State of the Internet report. But it promises then the fact that you can, if you pick your audience, today you can deliver 4K content, and we're talking about 15 megs per second. So I will say there's a range, and the 10 to 20 meg range is what we need to look at. We can do adaptive delivery of 4K. Maybe the 10 meg person doesn't get the greatest quality, but I can also show you 4K at 10 meg, 4K at 20 meg, and you will be hard put, in some cases, to see the difference if you're sitting back 8 feet from it in your couch. So there's a notion that with delivery over an unmanaged internet, which is what Akamai delivers through today, we can deliver 4K, we can stream it in real time to a fraction of the population. And I would argue that that fraction is large enough, it's in the 20 to 30% range at least, and higher in other states, for you to take some fraction of your catalog and start putting up candidate, just like Netflix is doing with House of Cards. It's their premium content, they put it up in 4K. There's going to be pressure in the system for everybody who owns content and delivers it to do something similar. Because if YouTube can give you 4K for free, and Netflix is doing it, then the pressure is going to be on you to start exploring that as well. So the trick is you cannot do it for everybody. You can certainly measure who you can do it to. You can know ahead of time. You don't offer it to everyone. You offer it to those people who, first of all, have a 4K TV, which is a limited subset. That group nicely self-selects because they're the sort of people who go and buy for good connectivity too. They're not buying the cheaper DSL when they've spent $2,000 on their 4K TV. So the Venn diagram of who's got good connectivity and who's got these big screens is quite a large overlap. And they're the people you can target today, some of your content. And that fraction that we can stream it to is going to increase over time. It's not going to decrease. And as I mentioned, it'll look like we're still struggling to deliver 1080p to everybody today, but we can certainly deliver 1080p quite reliably to most people, more than 50%. And the same eventually will be true of 4K. So it's not a hype that it's all going to happen this year, but you will start seeing it happening this year. And we're going to put out a site. I believe our director of marketing is in the back. He can shake his head furiously if he disagrees, but we're going to put out a public site with 4K samples. So you can go home and test it and see what you get in your house without any modification whatsoever. And that will be quite interesting. And we'll track the data and the success on that to see if our thesis about what we can deliver based on the stats is actually correct when it comes to delivery.
And start shooting your ads in 4K because it's going to take us forever to get them in the right format. Because God knows it's taken us that long to get to this point with 720p. Joe, can you talk to the audience about the complexities of acquiring and creating this content? I mean, you touched on it a little bit, but what burdens should the audience know in terms of storage and delivery? I know you said there are some challenges with throughput. What are the things from a production standpoint that these folks need to think about when they start, if it's months or a year from now, contracting people to shoot their episodic content or a commercial or whatever? What are the challenges, or what do you have to think about?
Well, I think from a mobile facilities side of our business, we've got the 53-foot trucks that can go out and do 12, 15 cameras at let's pick a festival. So obviously you've got much more data to store, archive. I think archive of the mezzanine asset is obviously critical. It's what you're spending all your money on. So you're dealing with a lot of data. You need to get that off site. Typically you're at a site where you've got a truck for 14 hours, that truck closes. You need to get that stuff archived off before that truck rolls, or your content is in jeopardy. So I think that's a big piece. When we start looking at live, it's obviously the transmission piece we talked about, just getting that stream off site, then getting it transcoded. That to us in the sort of live model seems like the biggest bottleneck. We've done some shows with opera that gets distributed to theaters, and it's just been it's a challenging process. It's sort of in the first days of transmitting HD. You had to match the encoder and the decoder. It had to be a harmonic encoder and decoder. You couldn't throw a Tandberg decoder in the mix. So you had a lot of those things. You had to have an engineer at every downlink site because it was sort of specialized hardware. Nobody really knew how to use it. Today we're 4 quadrants that you need to reassemble and line up. It's like we're back to aligning tube cameras. So it's that piece I think is a big variable on top of sort of that archive workflow. And I think once we get that piece solved, the encoding, the streaming piece, I think it's going to sort of fall in line. But those are two big variables.
I would think even from a monitoring perspective today, it's hard to do that in your organization, right? Because how many 4K monitors have we bought? It's not like they're scarce, but it's not like there's a whole pile of them that you can choose from, and the price is driving down to zero yet. I mean, it will eventually as the market adopts. But I mean, how many 4K monitors do you have in your facility today? Is there a handful, or is there like two?
Well, I think you're asking a very good question there that's alluding to the fact that in the production workflow, there's still this debate whether it's going to go coaxial SDI as the interconnect in the production environment, or whether it's going to really take a leap forward and go to 40 or 100 gig lane-based Ethernet next generation. I mean, I think that most people would say in the long run they'd like to see it go over to a more virtualized environment, but you can genuinely see a battle going on between the traditionalists wanting to do the old school broadcast, let's make it faster to get the throughput that we need. But that alludes directly to the issue that you're talking about monitors. Is it quad SDI, or is it just HDMI running further up the production chain and being used there? And I think that there are a few other issues. I mean, you started off talking about the analogy with 3D, and anyone who is new to the subject about 4K or Ultra HD would think that the standards that we've got will be a fait accompli and we're all ready to roll, and that the point's been proven between the merit of HD versus UHD. But I think there are still the issues about color space, HDR, that would really give UHD or 4K the edge over cinematic applications. But unfortunately, the screen manufacturers, they ran with the concept even before they'd got the interfaces sorted out on their TV, before they'd got that proper differential between the cinematic colorimetry that you can support and what's supported on those screens. And that's where this 15 megabit access rate figure has been firmly lodged in people's minds. Because if you do that comparison, it's a given that we're going to sell it into the high-end home cinema type applications where people will buy on the strength of resolution. Frame rates are relevant for cinematic applications because the assets are typically 24 frames. But if you're then trying to push on through and say, okay, let's have more spectrum for live sports delivery, it's really got to deliver on that improvement. And I'm not saying that these things won't happen, but they are going to take time, and that there genuinely is a stage where it's going to be introduced, get so far, and then rely upon something technical to give it the edge and that wow factor.
I think you've touched on something that we talked about before the panel as well, which is that, and you said this, Ian, that to a certain extent the CE industry kind of went and ran with things before the cake was fully baked. It's because of the notion that they can sell more monitors to us, right? Go buy a 4K monitor today because the content's there, right?
And I think there's one interesting thing that the discussion here is talking about 1080p being a given in the broadcast industry, and that's not the case. You know, I did a paper where we were actually looking on HD resolutions, and by far most of the content that's linear scheduled broadcast is 3/4 res, typically at a much lower frame rate. You know, it's still an interlaced world there. So, you know, in a way, these applications that we're talking about streaming, the socialization of 1080p is far more prevalent in streaming than it ever is there. So it does give the streaming applications that edge over traditional broadcast that's associated with interlaced video at quite low frame rates.
At the risk of asking one more gearhead question, though, Ian, because you're on a roll here, I've read that from a content preparation perspective, we're not talking live. So for a customer of yours to create a 4K asset for on-demand consumption, that it'll take 4 to 6 times as long to prepare that piece of content. Is that accurate?
I think it is. I think it's fair. I mean, I think that there was an excellent presentation this morning from Netflix where they were actually doing a warts and all type analysis of HEVC and saying it does deliver a benefit that we back and we're enthusiastic about, but it's nowhere near the percentage efficiencies that, you know, the sticker says it's going to deliver, and particularly with regard to the processing time for an HEVC asset where it would be encoded to actually deliver a definable performance improvement over X264 or H264, you're right in terms of those figures, because most of the tool set that you would need to apply to get that advantage means you're doing a 4 to 6x on real-time encoding. So yeah, it's an uncomfortable fact, because everyone wants to hit that time window when they do a live transmission, turn it around for OTT or iPlayer type applications, so it's ready to rock and roll after 20 minutes. But with those kind of processing times, that's never going to happen.
So this,
Yeah, hold on. That also assumes you've got a monolithic machine and you're feeding it this feed and needs to process it. So we have a cloud transcoding solution that can break the video up. So that really, if it's 4 to 6 times for the HEVC, we just run it to 4 to 6 times as many machines. So your time in, your time out will be the same, but it'll use more processing. But you can structure your transcoding so that if time is what matters, you can use more machines in parallel and get your content out faster.
right, sure. And I think the moral of the story here, too, is that we're not going to see libraries of content flip to 4K simply because the original pixels in the source file aren't there to be able to render 4K. But for new content that's created at that resolution, to your point, you either have to squeeze the balloon in one area or another, which is time or processing capacity. Okay. Joe, I still wanted to ask that question, and Ian ran off with the ball in a great direction. But so how many
It's
monitors?
0.
Yeah.
But I think an important thing is when we did this transition from SD to HD, a lot of facilities had one HD monitor for years. I mean, I was walking into uplink trucks a couple years ago that still had 27 SD monitors and one HD monitor. It's just in the last couple of years that the price point came down where it made sense and you'd rebuild your facilities. But yeah, I mean, not that long ago, there was the one engineering QC monitor, and that was it, and everything else was just viewed in a down-converted SD. So yeah, we have 0 today.
0 today,
Yeah.
but you do see them.
We do see them.
They'll be
They're on
coming
the
to your.
roadmap.
Yeah, you'll have some by. Is it fair to say by the end of the
Probably
year?
by the end of the year. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, our trucks have them. It's just our facility where all of our live operations does not. Today it just hasn't come up.
Okay.
For any of the trials, though, you really need to know what level of HDMI you've got, what standard. 4K or UHD trial is not for the timid here.
Right.
And doing uplink, terrestrial or satellite is challenging, simply because a lot of the infrastructure is immature at the moment, particularly for live events.
But from a development perspective, though, Joe, I think you told me before we started with the panel that you do have customers who are asking about
We have
4K.
customers are asking. They're all in the budgetary phases. They want to do something. They seem like they want to be first to market to do something live. But yeah, so we're preparing a lot of budgets and quotes today.
So, Will, one of the questions that we discussed via email, I want you to touch on and see, again, shoot holes in this if this isn't true, but someone had alluded to the fact that a content owner who wants to have 15% of their traffic come from content at 4K will see their monthly bandwidth bill increase by 30 to 40%. Is that a knee-jerk reaction, or is that accurate?
Okay, so go over the multiples
So
again.
if a content owner is offering 15% of their traffic at 4K, that someone's prognosticating that the incremental spend for them on a CDN is 30 to 40% additional. Is that accurate because of the
That would
size
probably
and the
happen.
resolution?
That's assuming some ratio that your average bitrate with HD versus your prospective bitrate with 4K.
Yep.
And yes, there's more bandwidth coming out, and it's going to cost more. The exact same argument is true for 1080 versus 720. And if you're looking at it purely from a cost perspective, then nobody should look at 1080 because it's always going to be 1.5 times more expensive than 720. The truth is, yes, 4K is more expensive. It's also a bigger experience. Nothing says the person delivering it has to monetize it the same way they do for 720. Today, you go to Apple TV, you buy your HD movie, costs more money than your SD. Same is true for Amazon. If I was selling 4K, it would be more expensive than the 1080. It would be another tier of delivery there. And there's no reason it has to somehow be the same price. The user's getting a different experience, and it can be monetized appropriately. Ads would need to be in 4K too if it's a freemium or type model.
Sure.
It's a complicating factor because the ad inventory doesn't exist in 4K, so you're going to upscale your 1080 ads. Won't look as good. But especially for live, and we did a live demo during NAB over the real internet publishing an encoder in Portland, Oregon, into Akamai, moving across to Las Vegas, and coming up in the middle of the show, which is hard to do. It was live at 14 megabits per second, HEVC, 60 frames per second sport. So this is really what the future for live sports broadcast should be. And it worked.
How many frames per second?
60. Yeah. And
Is
that
that-
needs HDMI 2.0 to get to the monitor in order to get your frame rate up.
I'll start with you, Will, and I know you touched on this a little bit, and I'd like all of you to weigh in. How do you see the first real implementations of this hitting the market? Is it going to be sports and maybe cinematic because of the need or the ability for that type of content to beg for the most resolution?
They've already hit the market. If you buy a Sony 4K TV, it comes bundled with the Sony Media Player, which includes a bunch of Sony titles, 60 or so, don't quote me on that, all in 4K standard. It's their library because they also own the picture, the studio side of the house. So we've seen it already come out. It's long-form theatrical. You want to sit back at home and get a fantastic experience. Having seen demos, I think the next area it's really going to shine will be live sports. It's a really compelling experience to watch. When you watch a game in 4K, it's like almost watching it on the field. You have to choose a portion of the screen to look at because it's too big. And it's just like a real game. You start watching individual players instead of the whole thing. And I think 4K at 60 for sports will be one of the drivers too. It's technically challenging, no one's discounting that. And there's a whole production workflow that's been mentioned. But in terms of pull from an audience, it's a big one.
But so a question there, and you can follow on it or someone else can chime in too, though. One of the things that I've thought about as a pragmatist with this type of content, though, is how close are you going to have to sit to a monitor to be able to tell the difference between 1080p and 4K? About 5 feet, right?
Well, there's a curve. I have the chart in my laptop. But yeah, if you're sitting 8 feet away from a 65-inch monitor,
You
that's
won't
sort
see
of the
it.
dividing line where you can't tell the difference
Right.
between 1080p and 4K. So under 65 inches, given dimensions of average living rooms, it's not worth sending 4K to a screen, that's for sure. But we're going to see 4K come out at 65 and go up to 80 inches. And in the 65 to 80, given living room geometry, your eyes, because my eyes are bad, but normal people eyes, will see the difference in 4K.
Will, would you advise a customer then, a content owner, to bifurcate between experiences then? If they 4K, you would want to create a business rule to where they're only going to offer it to customers where you can do a detection and check and see if their monitor is a certain size or
Absolutely.
throughput?
If I'm building a player today, if your player is on your phone, you know it's sideways or vertical, you're going to send less bits to it. You never want to send more quality than the end user can perceive.
Right.
Same is true for 4K. And there's many times it makes more sense to upscale 1080 because the upscalers are very good now. And you've got the content, you can deliver, maybe you can deliver that upscale 1080 more reliably and give a better quality of experience to the user than sending the 4K, which might rebuffer occasionally for that class of user. Others will be your premium users. I'm giving them 4K all the time because all the ducks are aligned.
Yeah, well said. Joe?
On the content side, I think sports is going to be the application that pushes devices. I see music as being the one that's easiest to replace and drop in a 4K workflow on the acquisition side. Because there's typically not one there. It's 30% more. It's a one-off event. It goes for 3 days. It's standalone.
Interesting. Ian,
I
thoughts
think
there?
as we're seeing now, the VOD cinematic content that there is out there, there's a good match between the content. It's already been acquired, arguably between 2K or 4K resolution. There are big libraries, and it's no surprise that people are marketing it there. But I think that what you are seeing is that a number of the big broadcast brands who are, let's face it, offering hybrid services, that they're backing both horses. They're talking about player type scenarios where they're going to have show reels to demo their capability. They're going to have Samsung apps to get brand recognition onto screens. But you're already seeing the early signs, probably Sky Deutschland doing the Bundesliga and B-Sky B doing early trials, and people like BT and so forth also doing these rugby trials. There's huge prestige for the broadcasters continue this bandwagon, irrespective of how far and where the sofa's positioned to the screen. They see that there's good traction between having premium quality associated with their brand. And I think where brand is strong, you will definitely see them pull through to the UHD and 4K area.
Follow on then there. So, and given some of the other things we've discussed here earlier, do you think it'll be easier for your broadcast customers to implement a 4K I hate to call it proof of concept, but to put something out on demand and then live comes later because live's a little more difficult to do because you get one shot at it?
I think you're absolutely right. The amount of times that people were coming at NAB or CES where they had been instructed to basically get attachment between their brand and 4K or UHD, they started off with the assumption that they were going to do it on a live event, but invariably it is in a streaming scenario, that the vast majority of the trials that we've been doing have been streaming scenarios where it's been pre-prepared content that's analogous to the cinematic application. But no doubt about it, they're trying to get that pull through because there's a good brand recognition points to be gained for saying, you know, we're trying to get our premium sports or film channel Ultra HD or 4K.
Okay. What are for any of you, and for the audience members here, as they're thinking about their workflows in the next, whatever it is, 12 to 18 months, what are the biggest bear traps? What are the things they need to think about as they leave this room and put their 4K plans together in their infrastructures? Will?
Well, even if you're very cautious about 4K, at least content you capture from today forward, if you're buying new cameras or you're archiving, make sure you're shooting at 4K or above and you're archiving at 4K and above. You can always make it smaller later. I think all the cameras we saw at NAB recently, pretty much every manufacturer has a 4K version now. And they're even at 6K and 8K. So at least archive in that.
We'll talk about that next year.
Yeah. I don't want to get into 8K. I think that's where we start getting silly. I think that's fine. That's fine for like the occasional CES demo. But we want to make money selling content to people over the top. And 4K is reasonable, 8K is out.
So
prepare by at least getting the content.
Yeah.
Acquisition and content creation, that's job number one for you. Joe?
I think acquisition and then storage and, you know, all of the typical file-based, DR, backup, making sure the things you would do in a normal workflow, they just become, there's just, four.
Does anybody have a mental data point? I know I'm putting you all on the spot, but the difference in a minute or 5 minutes or an hour worth of content from 1080p to 4K? It's 5 to 7x?
Well, it depends on your bit rate, because when we
Bitrate,
say
I think that's a very good question there, because if we go back to this 15 megabit access rate, where people say down convert it, and let's say arguably you'd be transmitting, say, 1080p that's meant to be upscaled on the screen. People are talking about 7 to 8 megabits, and then they're talking about 16 megabits for native HEVC. There's no way a one-to-one relationship between talking about an asset at 1080p resolution compared to upscaling it, let's say, for 4K. And one of the things that was included this morning where Netflix were actually talking about it, the biggest bang for the buck of using HEVC is the scaling in terms of block sizes. That you could genuinely say that comparing an H.264 encoder with an HEVC encoder, you can get 50% or above in terms of compression efficiency. Below HD, you can't get that simply because the most efficient tools in the HEVC tool set are best applied to sort of Ultra HD.
That's a good point, Ian, and Will, I'll come back to you to touch on it. So talk to us a little bit about the improvements in compression technology relative to the move from 1080p to 4K, AVC versus HEVC, right? We're able to compress content a great deal more, even though we're adding 4 times the resolution, correct?
So I'm not going to talk too much with a real compressionist on the table, but we've done a bunch of tests. H.264 or AVC is a mature technology now. It's been out 8 to 10 years. We are very good at wringing out every bit of performance on it. And compared to standard X264, which itself is a good encoder, we're able to get efficiencies of 30% if you really tweak it down from that. And that's sort of pushing you into HEVC range, but using AVC. The advantage is now you have all the devices. Every device in every pocket in this room can play AVC. So we actually believe if you can encode 4K using AVC at between 10 and 20 megs this year if you want to get it out and you don't have devices that are HEVC decoders. And then you can start transitioning that same spectrum, say 7 to 15 megabits in HEVC as those devices come out. We don't need to be stuck at 15. You need to be at 15 if you've got high action sport. But I can show you demos that are standard theatrical drama that look very good at 12 meg AVC and at 8 meg HEVC. And it's all a question of where you want to encode it and the trade-off with storage and bandwidth and delivery.
Great. Ian,
I
Ian,
think
thoughts
that's
there?
what I totally agree with what Will says, but the one thing that I think that is meaning that we're having a far more exciting real-world discussion about streaming of 4K and UHD that I think will happen is that the broadcasters have got a tough act to follow with the likes of Netflix getting huge mileage out of 4K House of Cards, where for the broadcasters to actually repeat that kind of exercise with a premium sports event is a whole different matter in terms of the workflow and throughput. And one example of that is you were talking about the production workflow. The one thing that we have skipped across is what format is going to be actually used in that production workflow and what compression scheme is going to be used as a mezzanine format in a production environment. Now, you could have 3 sessions just on talking about that subject because, you know, is it RAW, the format, or one of the editable codec formats? And that gives you some kind of idea of the level of problem that linear scheduled broadcast has got compared to competing against the likes of Netflix and the streaming environment, where to actually replicate a true native 4K workflow in a live scenario is way, way more complicated than in the streaming scenario.
Absolutely. Great. Well, I would wrap up by echoing something Will said, and I hate to pick on him again, but he said something I think is poignant in that I think we're not trying to overhype this. We're trying to say that this is a trend that's eventually going to come, but you're not going to run out and get a monitor next week and flip your whole library and begin streaming in 4K. So I think we've answered a lot of questions here, and we're ready to take a couple if the audience has any questions. We do have some time in our allotted slot here. Go ahead.
This question is for Joe. If somebody gave you a blank check, a 4K production truck, a mobile production facility, could you even do it today? Because I look around and I mean, just getting the signal off the football field to a truck is a problem today. I mean, there's no radio gears, and it takes 4 coaxes for each camera, and then you've got to try to find a production switcher. I don't know how you can replay. I mean, how would you do it? Like, is it even possible?
So it is possible. Our handful of our trucks, one of our LA-based trucks can do 4K. It's one of our 3D trucks, which obviously isn't doing a lot of 3D
That's
work right
funny.
now. But it was built to support. Will do 4K. All right, can you do? Is there a deco that does 4K? No. So you don't have any graphics. I think EVS might have something, but you know now your $250,000 EVS. I don't even know what it costs. So yes, we can bring cameras in, we can switch them, and we can route them out. But everything else that your producer is going to show up and want graphics and slow-mo and all those things that make a production, yeah, those are challenging. That's why it's working well on things like the Opera. There are no graphics. You know, they put up a slate at the end that says copyright.
It's like the early days of HD.
It's the early days of HD. It's
Yeah.
the PBS demos of the nice
The
plants.
close-up of the flower.
So yeah, yes, we'll take a blank check. We can build a truck. Will it have all the functionality? You're still going to be making a 1080p version to put graphics on, and you know all those other things, closed captioning. You know, we haven't gotten into all the other pieces that need to fit into the workflow for a true broadcast.
4K graphics crawls across the bottom of the screen. They'll never look unclear. Anyone else? Go ahead.
I think this may be a question best suited for Will. Kind of the beginning of this panel discussion talks a little bit about infrastructure, right, and throughput of the infrastructure. Like, how do you see the development of fiber to the home over the next few years, and how do you think that will affect 4K proliferation?
So I'm biased because I wish I had fiber to my home. I don't. I'm one of the areas that doesn't get it, but it's obviously proliferating. As Google Fiber came out, Fios has been out for a while, and we're starting to see, as a reaction to those two drivers, all AT&Ts announcing gigabit coax. So whether it's coax or fiber, doesn't really matter. It's this very high throughput to the home. Just because it's high from your home to your ISP doesn't mean that you can sustain a high throughput over the internet. So that's one of the problems. Now, an advantage for Akamai as a CDN is our whole business model is getting our content deep within every ISP. So we can theoretically get it very close to an edge server. I did a little test before I walked in here from the Wi-Fi in this hotel to see how far away my Akamai server was. It was 8 milliseconds away. And the advantage of that is our whole corporate focus is the short time. And that really matters as the throughput goes up. Because of TCP windowing, the shorter your RTT, the higher the throughput you can get. So we have a good architectural advantage when it comes to delivering 4K that a lot of our competitors who use regionalized data centers don't have. Because when you're at 50 milliseconds away, even your theoretical throughput is lower than at 8 milliseconds.
It's kind of a small follow-up question to that. Besides upgrading infrastructure like fiber to the home, do you think in the next few years, do you see any other like transmission or encoding technologies that will increase?
So there's a lot of technologies that can help. So say we can't stream to you at 10 megs or 15 megs per second. I can still get you your 4K movie over your DSL line. It'll just take a little longer to get to you. But you can certainly build a business model around that, forwarding and pre-positioning. Maybe I only send the first 5 minutes or 10 minutes of the movie to your house. And we start looking at where can we trade storage for bandwidth, because they're the inverse of one another. So if your home router, for example, had a 5 gig hard drive in it, and we did a demo of this at CES with Qualcomm, now I can start putting movies right there. That's always connected. It's got power all the time. It can act as a little local server for your 4K. So we can start pre-positioning content, maybe even ads or things like that. We can look at P2P delivery. I know there's, BitTorrent put a bit of taste in everybody's mouth, but P2P, especially for live or concurrently viewed content, is an efficient architecture. We need to we need to protect it, we need to manage it, we need to make sure the ISP is in control of it, so we're not using their bandwidth for free, but it's still a good architecture to go after. Multicast is another one we're looking at. Multicast can lower the ISP's traffic load dramatically, again, for live sports events. And we're pursuing strategies around all three of those in an attempt to do what we can. You're seeing an ecosystem where CDNs have traditionally just been on the server side and that's it. And now we're seeing them migrate out of that into the client world, where in order to eke out efficiencies, we're having to put a little bit of software inside every device.
I think most of the broadcasters, to back up Will's point, most of the interest that we're seeing, particularly amongst the hybrid broadcasters, the ones who have a big interest in terms of content multi-screen, as well as a linear scheduled service, what they're interested in is VOD initially to get those services going, and all of the forums, they're essentially talking about taking an asset, making it available for VOD and catch-up. And I think that adds clarity to the question about how many X times real time are people prepared to put onto an asset at the moment to basically get that bit rate down. And certainly it is possible to do a live encoder using HEVC. It's just got to come in at the right competitive point for the sports broadcasters to feel that they can justify an increment over existing HD services. And I think there are a lot of people who are very carefully looking at that. When does it make sense to break on through and go for a live service? And if you look at what the EBU are saying, they're predicting that point being sometime between 2017 and 2020 for there to be full UHD services offering premium sports and film content. But I do come back to this thing again, that the discussion is far, far more active in the streaming, player and game console market, because that will happen a lot earlier.
Any other questions?
Yeah, you were sort of touching on the subject, but I think whenever you hear 4K, people are so focused on the resolution, but you were talking about the frame rates as well, because a big deal with the real Ultra HD is get the better frame rate and everything is sort of more there. Do you think people will be more sort of embracing the higher frame rate side of
Initially,
because we're still streaming sports in like 25 or 30 FPS, and it's really not what we need.
initially 4K was marketed on resolution. Frame rate then came into the game And it's sort of through the back door, you know, sort of in the streaming environment, they understand it's got to be progressive. And it goes back to the point that I made earlier, where essentially broadcast is interlaced at quite a low frame rate. But I freely accept that the train left the station with all of the screen manufacturers on board saying, we've got big plant that have got to ship screens. You know, we cannot wait for HDMI to sort itself out in terms of getting the throughput for the higher frame rate. We cannot wait for colorimetry and high dynamic range. So it's way left the station at the moment. And for a clean technical discussion, you know, that addresses more than just the resolution and frame rate, it requires more standards and more work.
Yeah, there's other, it's not only size that matters. Things like high dynamic range, color gamut, increased brightness, those can all have a pronounced effect on the viewing experience. And it isn't just the assumption that because you're bigger, you're better. And I hope obviously we get bigger and brighter and with a better color gamut at the end of the day, but as a content owner, you might decide I'm going to take 1080p and make it brighter and scale it up. And my end user, for their bandwidth level, might get a better experience. There's not a lot of HDR sets. There isn't a standard today. Dolby are doing Dolby Vision. I don't know if other ones are coming out, but it's a little fractured, whereas at least 4K is a size. It's close. It's 2160 pixels. We can argue about how wide it is. But we can coalesce around that in the short term. But
I think a lot of the broadcasters are very, very worried because they're still sort of strapped to the set-top box. In a streaming environment, the players, the games consoles, there really is the prospect of somebody making an alliance. I mean, Will alluded to Dolby, there's also Technicolor, and there are other HDR schemes. Just because of the software download and player type market, it's far more likely that in a streamed environment, they would be able to offer that kind of advantage that offers an interesting prospect of a streaming application eclipsing what's going on linear scheduled delivery, and also a disturbing prospect for cinema owners that, you know, the same trick could be played upon them where they could shorten the release cycle to go direct to home. That brings content protection issues into play, but that gives you an idea of why people are positioning 4K commercially.
Great. Anyone else?
When do you think you can deliver to 50% of the population a 4K signal with, let's say, 10 megabits per second or 12 megabits per second? I imagine that it will be clear that the rate of compression will slightly increase. And there's a moment where the curves are going to meet and half of the population will be able to receive 4K.
so if you live in South Korea or Japan, our answer would be tomorrow. Though they have a very high average throughput, you can sustain that rate. The answer for the United States will be beyond this year. Based upon the curve of the last 7 years, I would say maybe next year or the year after. Based upon a trajectory, you want 50% across the board. But I think you can get 50% again within certain markets. You can go.
For example, for film, I assume 24 frames per second, you may not need 50.
No, you only need about
Yeah.
10 megabits for film, and I think
Yeah.
that's where you
Yeah, you can probably go 8 meg for a drama at 24 frames per second. 8 meg HEVC looks very nice.
Yeah, but if James Cameron gets his way, that won't be the case. We'll shoot all films at 60p.
True. I mean,
There was one more question over here.
Yeah, so speaking about the benefits of UHD, are they tangible enough, do you think, for the demand by consumers to continue to spur development on the bandwidth side, the production side, along the same lines as what happened from the jump to SD and HD was so pronounced that, you know, it was very visible even to the average person, and there was sort of a rush to buy HD TVs. Do you foresee a stagnation in demand at some point after the early adopters sort of trickle off and it causes the other people in the industry to pull back their investment a little bit?
David Woods from the EBU made a fantastic comment back in 1998 and said, this is the year of HD. And he was probably about 10 years out, and he freely, sort of admits how foolhardy that statement was. I think that what will happen now is that we're already seeing tremendous interest in 4K and UHD for VOD, Netflix type application, and that's going to take it so far. And for me, really, the question is how quickly 4K can transition from a darkened home cinema environment to the bright lights of the living room. And I think that the best predictions, the figures that I've got are not for 50% adoption, but for 35% adoption, are talking in that 2017 to 2020 area. And undoubtedly, it's Japan, Korea, and Middle East where they've got either a strong government backing for it, or they haven't got quite so much legacy to overcome in terms of HD and SD infrastructure.
Great. Well, panelists, thank you. Great information. Appreciate it. Thank you for attending, and hope you have a great show.